There's a lot of people that can't make it. They're on the beaches of Cancun or Cabo, and they asked me to record it because they're very interested in it. But yeah, thanks for joining us, Bill. I have a collection of brokers and office leaders here, and interesting. I think so. Bill is an advocate. He worked on a lot of these bills with Washington Association of Realtors with Nathan Gordon. And so a couple weeks ago, we had the new construction advisory group get together with talking about what was changing in the housing bills that we thought were going to go through. And we had Nathan Gordon jump on a Zoom call really quickly, just telling us a little bit about what's happening in the legislative world. And a lot of questions came up with regard to House Bill 110. Specifically, it allows for duplexes and fourplexes and sixplexes as you get into bigger and bigger cities. And there's the 25 to 75,000 population that you can do certain things with, and then the 75,000 plus population that you can do even more in. And a lot of questions came out as far as how does that relate to other things that city requires, such as setbacks, sidewalks, impervious surface area, things along those lines. And so I asked Bill to come on and just kind of explain a little bit of the devil of the details of what this is and what this bill will do, and what are the opportunities for builders, what are the opportunities for homeowners, and what are the opportunities that we should be looking at as far as real estate agents and as far as offices are concerned. So hopefully that sets you up a little bit, Bill. Maybe you can give a little bit of background on yourself as well, and we'll dive deep. And this is relatively informal. I don't anticipate that we will spend an entire 2 hours on this, but maybe there's a bunch of questions that pop up from the conversation. So
yeah, okay. No, that sounds good, John. Thanks. Happy to be here and see some new faces. I see some familiar faces in Jim and Bobby and people that have been active in Washington Realtors government affairs stuff through the years. So, and this is helpful to me too, because, with the activity at the legislature that just got done last week, then we will shift into like implementation of these different laws. And so we're still trying to figure out, what's helpful to real estate firms and brokers out there in terms of like, it's not just the middle housing bill. Middle housing is what I refer to as House Bill 1110, which is the bill we'll probably talk about most today, but there are a host of other bills on, making sure that all cities allow accessory dwelling units. And in the condominium bill, there's a requirement that all cities have to provide unit lot subdivisions that some cities right now allow to create fee simple lots for townhouse construction. There's a bunch of things in all these bills that will be implemented, not immediately, but over the next couple of years. And so part of what I'd ask from you is to think about like what's helpful for Washington Realtors to produce to help get these bills implemented, because there is an implementation period with local governments. And we worked with a couple different law firms on some of the details of these bills. So we'll keep doing that. So whatever can, what resources we can put together to distribute broadly, think about that, and we'll do that over the remainder of the year. So just on background, so I'm based in Olympia. I'm an attorney and lobbyist. I'm policy director for Washington Realtors. And so I represent the association on a lot of different issues. Obviously, we worked on the real estate agency law bill this year that Bobby was a part of with our presidential advisory group making changes to 1886, but primarily also covered all of the different housing and land use bills. And there were a whole host of bills that passed this year. So we'll go through those. And then, shifting to non-legislative time, which will be the rest of this year, these bills will be implemented by primarily cities, less role for counties, but primarily by cities. And the big shift that happened this legislative session really was the question of, would the legislature step in and at least create minimum housing requirements that cities have to allow, right? So since the origin of the Growth Management Act, which was the early 90s, Washington has had a very locally driven, kind of local control based land use planning framework under the GMA. And that really shifted this year, finally, with the legislature stepping in and saying certain cities have to at least allow duplexes or fourplexes or ADUs or up to sixplexes. in a way that the legislature's never really stepped in before. Cities have opposed that because cities focus on maintaining their local control over land use and zoning and permitting decisions. But given the housing market and this trend around the country on kind of state legislative action on kind of minimum zoning requirements, the legislature finally stepped into that area this year and so passed a number of the bills that we'll go through today. And that's really the kind of sea change this year was the legislature stepping in and making actual kind of zoning development kind of regulations in essence that apply to certain cities. The key point I think also is the timing of this. So legislature ended last week. The bills will be signed by the governor next week. They take effect in July, but most of the like the middle housing bill, the ADU bill, some of the permitting streamlining kind of bills have to be implemented by cities generally within 6 months of their next Growth Management Act comprehensive plan update. So there's a schedule in statute for when cities and counties have to update their GMA comp plans. For Central Puget Sound, I think it looks like we have mainly a Central Puget Sound audience here today. Central Puget Sound counties, King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap, have growth management comp plan update deadlines of the end of 2024. So they'll have to incorporate these new requirements into their comp plans within 6 months, or basically 6 months after December of 2024, so June of 2025, let's say. So they don't take effect immediately, but I think what takes effect immediately is looking at what are the opportunities either for existing homeowners or for land acquisition for properties that have infill potential for the duplex to sixplex kind of construction, or underutilized lots that can turn you have a small house on a bigger lot and it's a tear down that you can replace with a series of townhouses. That kind of activity, getting that kind of analysis going now over the next 2 years, so that when the laws do take effect, you positioned your clients to take advantage of it. So why don't I stop there? That's my kind of opening comments of kind of what we're talking about today. John, I'll stop if there's any questions on that, and then if not, we can just jump into a couple of the bills.
Yeah, and this is extremely informal, so if you do have questions, by all means, raise your hand, ask questions. I think there, how many housing bills went through total?
About 12.
12, and they're all going to be signed on the same day, right? He's going to do a housing.
Yeah, it sounds like I saw a list of about 8 or 9 of them that are getting signed next week. I don't think they'll be all at the same time, but I mean, most of them, at least 8 to 10 will be, I think, next Tuesday, it looks like.
And I know that we'll get into some of the details as far as parking and, sort of Mercer Island, sort of squabbles as far as that's concerned. And but from your perspective, was this really sort of pushing this down to the cities, forcing their hand just because they were inept at doing it themselves, or they're afraid that they were going to be, their constituents were going to vote against them? Or what do you think the impetus of forcing this down, sort of cities' throats was?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture. It's a mixture of, you have some cities who frankly have been pretty active on allowing more density, more middle housing, which is, duplex to sixplex and cottage homes and townhouses, that level of development. Some cities have been actually fairly proactive on that, but others have not, right? There are a number of cities that, and I mean, it was an interesting debate. And to go back, Bobby or Jim might remember this within legislative steering at realtors. We were part of the local control movement too, right? In the early days of GMA, it was, realtors and home builders and others. We didn't want Olympia mandating things on cities. We just figured it's better if you came up with growth plans locally. But then as time's gone on, you do have a lot of cities where, of the residentially zoned areas, 85% is in single family detached housing, and people are just not able to build ADUs. There are a lot of regulations that on their face allow ADUs, but make it so complicated and costly to build that functionally you can't build them. So there's a lot of things like that the bill streamlined this year. So it was partly inaction on the part of cities, but it was also some cities were saying, for example, compare Renton to Mercer Island, or compare, Kirkland, that's been more active on some of the infill type housing than Newcastle. Some cities were saying, we're making the hard choices politically, locally to allow more growth. Our neighbors are not. We're taking the heat from our neighbors. And I saw, there were some organized movements in, Edmonds. I saw some Kirkland neighborhoods, Shoreline, against some of the middle housing and kind of upzoning, and even stronger against a bill that didn't pass on transit-oriented development. And it's like, if I had a house in the Highlands, I wouldn't want a bunch of duplexes by me either, right? And that's just human nature. But the reality, I think, for at least for the Realtors Association that we got to over the last couple of years, is the urban growth areas are what they are. They're not expanding. Infill development's increasingly important, and cities aren't getting it done locally. It's just not happening because of the internal pressure against growth. We had a meeting with with Seattle King County Realtors a couple of years ago and talked through with them and master builders, if in some of the cities that are really not helpful to infill kind of levels of development, if you had realtors, master builders, the environmental community, and the labor community all in support of upzoning, would that get done through your city council? And their answer was no, because there's too much institutional resistance at certain councils to more growth. So to us, that said a lot, right? If you have the development community, the environmental community, and the labor community all on the same page, and that still can't get through a city council, it tells you that you got to go to another level of government, which is why there was so much action at the state legislature this year. Frank,
question?
Yeah, so realizing and respecting that every county has its different issues, legislatively, they can tell us, or the counties or the cities, what needs to be built in certain areas. But in Kitsap, our biggest challenge is overregulation and time. If you want to build a house, it's a 2-year program. And if your median price home is $526,000, about $126,000 of that goes to permits and regulatory fees and extra expenses in building. So while we can tell them what needs to be built, it's never going to get built because it takes so doggone long. Do any of these bills help curtail some of those and reduce the time and the cost to build a house?
Yeah, so there are bills in different areas, right? There were a number of kind of these zoning bills that had minimum requirements that cities have to allow duplex to sixplex in certain areas by size and accessory dwelling units. There's also a group of bills that dealt with SEPA and provided exemptions from SEPA, which is the State Environmental Policy Act, for all residential housing within the urban growth area. And compliance with SEPA is typically been one of the more complicated processes for builders. A lot of the appeals that come from the local level are based on SEPA appeals. So there's a pretty strong SEPA bill that passed. Some projects, depending on the city you're in, have to go through design review. There was a bill that made a lot of changes to the design review process, so it cannot be based on a kind of subjective, citizens committee, architects committee of, we don't like the color of the brick, or we don't like the color of the siding. It has to be based on objective development regulations and done at the same time that other building permit review occurs. And then there was a pretty major permit streamlining bill that passed to move all cities toward kind of online electronic permitting, with a fair amount of funding to upgrade a lot of the permitting systems within cities. And we can I'll get into more details on that bill a little bit later. But I think there's a recognition of that just creating increases in zone capacity in and of itself it's part of the issue, but it's not the entire issue. And so you need to have a lot of permit streamlining going on too.
Thank you.
So why don't I hop into the so-called middle housing bill? Can you guys see my screen okay? If I
You should be able, you haven't shared it yet.
Okay. Let me do that. Let me find my best. All right, can you guys see that okay?
Yes.
And so I tried, this was a, 35, 40 page bill probably. And, you'll find it interesting just politically as the bill starts, there's that analogy that, lawmaking is like sausage making that you don't really want to see how it's made. It's also kind of like, I analogize it kind of to like a demolition derby, where it's like a car that looks good at the beginning, and after a series of successes crashes, you still have to keep it moving forward. So it's not necessarily the prettiest looking car at the end, but hopefully it still runs, right? So as the bill started, it was much more simple because the effort from the key bill sponsors and from the groups that supported this, and you'll find interesting, the major supporters of this included ourselves, FutureWise, who through the years we've worked not in cooperation with on a lot of issues because they've been, pretty strong against any sort of rural development and really trying to rein in the size of urban growth areas. But ourselves, FutureWise, the labor community was super involved, master builders, home builders, a few cities supported it. And then throughout the session, a number of other cities and the Association of Cities worked to make fairly substantial changes to reflect the size of cities, with their position being smaller cities don't have the capacity for growth that big cities do. Bigger cities have more transit. There should be more housing close to transit, those kinds of themes. And to build into it some level of flexibility for cities as these get implemented over the next couple of years. So I'll just run through this summary. So, the main part is cities over 7, and this is statewide, right? So any city in the state of Washington with over 75,000 in any residentially zoned area has to allow 4 units per lot. And one thing you'll see in some of the descriptions of the bills, that it says that you have to allow fourplexes everywhere. That's not quite right, in that if you go down to the kind of 4th bullet where it says middle housing types allowed, the language in the bill says you have to allow 4 units per lot, right? But that the cities must allow 6 of the 9 specified middle housing types to meet that 4 unit requirement. So the easiest way is to allow fourplexes, but you could do it through townhouses, you could do it through courtyard apartments or other kind of mechanisms. Cities have to allow 6 of the 9. And so as that plays out locally, you could have areas where cities will say, we're gonna zone for single family up to fourplexes here, and include courtyard apartments and townhouses, right? And would be a permitted use within that zone. One key thing about the middle housing legislation is single family housing can still be built, right? So if you're in an area that now has this middle housing up zone, that doesn't eliminate single family zoning. If a developer wants to build a single family house detached, they can do that. It just means cities have to give the landowner, the developer, the option of those middle housing types. So over 75,000, 4 units per lot. Within a quarter mile of transit, 6 units per lot. And the definition down below of transit stops includes light rail, like Sound Transit, commuter rail, which is like the Sounder line that goes up through, Lakewood, Sumner, Auburn, etc. And then also bus rapid transit, or the option for 6 units per lot anywhere in any residential zones if 2 units are designated as affordable. At least from what we've heard from, the master builders folks we work with, they don't necessarily see the 2 affordable units set aside as necessarily penciling out, because again, a third of the units have to be affordable. It has to be affordable for 50 years. Those units have to be comparable in size and finish quality and stuff to the other units. So it's not as if you could build, 4 kind of higher end grade townhomes and then have 2 that are more lower builder grade that are smaller bedrooms. They have to be comparable. So I think the 6 unit allowance probably is more, the nonprofit housing community, nonprofit developers, Habitat for Humanity, stuff like that, which is fine. It's just, that's probably the product that will fit in that area. So then cities between 25,000 and 75,000, the zoning kind of steps down a bit, right? So it's 2 units per lot in all residential zones, 4 units within a quarter mile of transit, and then 4 units per lot if 1 unit is designated as affordable with those same kind of affordability characteristics. And then you go down to the smallest area, cities that are under 25,000, and this is kind of a weird concept, with their urban growth area contiguous with the urban growth area of the largest city within the county, in counties over 275,000. So those are the 4 central Puget Sound counties, plus Thurston, Spokane, and Clarke. And so what that means is if you're a city under 25,000, like Sumner, right? So Sumner is 12 or 15,000. Its urban growth area for Sumner is connected to Puyallup. Puyallup is connected to Tacoma. So it's not directly adjacent to Tacoma, but it's contiguous with that larger Pierce County urban growth area. It's under 25,000. It would have to allow duplexes or 2 lots within all residential zones. So that's how it would work in a city like Sumner. You think of other like smaller King County cities that would be connected. Now, if you have a disconnected city, what's a city whose urban growth area is entirely disconnected from the largest city? North Bend, for example, right? North Bend how big is North Bend? 10,000, 15,000. North Bend wouldn't be included in this because they don't have a contiguous UGA. So it's really the city's effort on this, as I would characterize it, is to kind of direct the density increases into those cities that are closest into central Puget Sound, and then also closest into the largest city within their county. So, anything that touches on Spokane, anything that touches on Vancouver, for example, is how that would play out. Soak that in for a sec. Any questions on that? And one thing we're working on is like some sort of map, right? Some of this stuff's easiest to understand. Like if you see a map that explains like, here's where this applies, and here's where the 4-unit versus 6-unit versus 2-unit kind of thing applies. So we got a question up, hand up.
Eric?
Yes. Go ahead, Tim.
Is the state going to supply money for infrastructure like sewers, for example? Because we have lots and lots of lots that are designated as septic that we can't put septics on in certain jurisdictions. So if we want to create density, I don't see how we're going to do that without the infrastructure there to actually to build it.
Like CTAC?
Yeah, like Federal Way, like many.
Yeah. No, that was a big part of the discussion. And so like a lot of, the comment earlier about just increasing the zone capacity in and of itself is not enough if you don't have the infrastructure for that level of development to occur. And so the infrastructure discussion is still part of this, or still has to be the necessary infrastructure. The one thing we worked on that kind of runs alongside this bill is there was a program that in the 90s to mid 2000s or so was the main infrastructure program for medium-sized cities called the Public Works Assistance Account. It has been rated by the legislature the last 10 years to pay for initially the kind of budget crash after the financial crisis in 2008 and 9, and then it was kind of rated again for McCleary on the education funding effort when that occurred in 2010 to 2015 or so. The diversions of all those funds has finally stopped this session, so that program will have about 500 million in it this year, under the recognition that to get the level of development needed, there's going to have to be infrastructure funds available for cities. That's a low interest loan program. The other upside, I think, is the bipartisan infrastructure law at the federal level has substantial increases in water and sewer funding. So the state implements 2 of the major infrastructure programs. One's the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund for expansion of water systems. The other is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which is for expansion of sewer capacity. So those have significant increases in funding at the state level. It's basically a pass through of federal money through the state budget, but there will be a lot more money for infrastructure because of those 2 programs. But I think it's if you looked at the infrastructure issue is, if the need is $1 billion, they're 20% of the way there or something like that, and the need is in the multiple billions, I should say. So, other questions on that? Let me scroll down here. We touched on the middle housing types. We touched on the implementation date. We touched on the definition. This bullet here where my cursor is, that cities have like an alternative compliance path with approval of Department of Commerce. And again, that's another kind of, sea change in kind of land use law in the state of Washington, which is there's never before been any sort of state agency or state level approval of growth management plans. It's always been locally driven. They get reviewed by Department of Commerce at the state level, and Commerce can opine on them, but they don't actually approve them. Here, there's flexibility for cities to say that these upzones can occur instead of within 100% of the residentially zoned areas. The upzone would occur only in 75% of those lots, with 25% of the lots not being upzoned for certain areas, right? So if you don't have the infrastructure, if you have critical areas under, wetlands or fish and wildlife habitat areas or things like that, those areas can be not subject to the zoning increase for some period of time. The requirement for cities is if they're going to use this alternative compliance path, they have to show how they're going to ultimately get the infrastructure necessary for areas that aren't served by sewer, things like that. So it's not a complete kind of opt out for the cities. They have to seek Department of Commerce approval of that, then with the kind of work plan on how they're going to come into compliance. And then when I just finish off these two, another big issue that's come up in a lot of areas has been, while cities may allow more development, the parking requirements that they impose can be really costly. And so one of the provisions within the bill is within a half mile of transit, cities are prohibited from mandating off-street parking. And again, there was a bill we can talk about a little more about, a much stronger transit-oriented development bill that didn't pass. But they can't require off-street parking if you're close to transit. And then it limits parking requirements to one space per unit for lots that are less than 6,000 square feet. So trying to get away from the more costly parking requirements that certain cities have. And again, it doesn't mean that the developer can't choose to provide parking if they want to do that. If that's the nature of the project that the developer wants to build, that's fine. It's just that cities cannot mandate that on the developer. And then the other question we get a lot is, and it came up with a lot of legislators and from homeowners association groups around the state, how does this affect homeowner associations that have already been platted, that have CC&Rs about minimum lot size or density prohibitions, or you can't have duplexes, or you can't have accessory dwelling units? Those kind of contractual agreements remain in place. It's not conclusive yet, but there's this idea that the HOA bylaws or recorded covenants are a contractual agreement between private parties. And if the state comes in and passes a law that conflicts with that contract, there's what's called an impairment of contract theory, that the state government has unlawfully impaired a private contract, and so it's unlawful. Now, that area of law is fairly unsettled. So I think this is going to be subject to further refinement through the years, because especially in like the Sound Transit footprint, there are some areas that are very close to current or future light rail stations that have prohibitions against increased density. And they may test out this theory of, can you in fact upzone areas in a way that conflicts with existing HOA or recorded CC&Rs. Any questions on that? Let me ask you, or just think about it, John, we can chat later about it. Is this the level of detail that you think is helpful to the brokerage community? More detail, less detail? Because we're still trying to sort out, like, what kind of info do we pump out here over the next couple months?
I think this is all really good. I think, I think the one thing that I would say is it'd be great to like say, this is what you can do in this area, right? Like if we listed out the cities, and I put it in chat, sort of what cities and the population of the cities as of 2021. But for these cities, these are the rules that apply. For these cities, these are the rules that apply. And there's certain cities like Woodinville, which I happen to live in, that are right on that cusp of 25,000 people. And so at what point in time do they have to enact this rule as well?
Yeah. Well, yeah, then that's also an issue too. Cities over time, and at least down in Olympia, Woodinville has a very bad reputation as an anti-growth city. And again, I know people like their horse farms, but horse farms inside urban growth areas don't necessarily help us with our housing issues we have. Now, no knock on you, John, if you have a horse farm, but I'm not a big horse guy. So, but cities can in fact grow into these levels, right? So if you're a city that, I think Mercer Island, Woodinville are just under 25,000. Over time, they'll bump up into that range. And once they do, then these provisions take effect. So.
I have a question. I'm a little bit confused now with the new laws. Will those override current zoning?
Yes.
It will.
Yeah.
If it was single family, it could be any of the above, depending on
Yeah.
your population.
Yeah. And so it'll override existing zoning within 6 months of the date that city has to update their growth management and comprehensive plan. So it doesn't override it immediately or this year. Kitsap, Snohomish, King, and Pierce counties and the cities within those counties have to update their comprehensive plans by the end of 2024. So within 6 months of the end of 2024, that's when these provisions take effect for cities within those 4 counties.
All right, we got one more question for you, Bill.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm pretty involved in the zoning in my town in Federal Way. And as I read this, I see lawyers frothing at the bit here. This is going to bring about a lot of lawsuits, as I see it. Like, for example, with the HOA restriction there. I see, depending on the activity of the HOA, there's going to be a lot of pushback from changes in zoning. For the same reason that the state went around all the cities to do this in the first place. But how do you see that? I mean, do you see some pit holes here that are going to end up in court? Because I sure.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't think that's an unrealistic expectation. A few things I think will smooth that out. One is that all the details of the bill will be subject to specific guidance from Department of Commerce. And as I mentioned earlier, originally the feeling within the realtors community and home builders and others was that we did not want, guidance from ecology or guidance from Olympia, whether it's Commerce or Department of Ecology, to govern local land use plans. That's changed. And now we do, right? Because you have jurisdictions that are fairly anti-growth. And so one, I think the implementation and the interpretation of certain parts of the bill will be subject to guidance by Department of Commerce, which will be persuasive in terms of what the bill actually means and what it requires. It also speaks to the importance of, I think, being involved through the local realtor associations and working with, master builders and others as these get implemented, because again, there will be an implementation period between now and the end of 2024 within all of the cities. And so making sure that cities don't find ways to weasel out of some of these requirements. And there's a concern that some will. There's also a concern that like the CC&R and HOA issues, the bill's not effective yet, right? The bill takes effect 90 days after the end of session, which is July 23rd of 2023. So if you had an HOA right now, you could update your HOA bylaws and different provisions that govern the HOA, perhaps to thwart some of the provisions of this bill. Will people within HOAs do that? I guess we'll see, but there'll be a fair amount of litigation over this. And that's just, again, when the early days of GMA, there was a lot of GMA driven litigation when GMA was brand new, just like there'll be a fair amount of litigation here, I think, because there's so many different provisions. And I think that's just not, I don't think you can avoid that.
Yeah, there's I'm looking at it from the application level. Joe developer comes to my town and he wants to put in whatever kind of development that he wants. And he's gonna do the permit process through the city of Federal Way, for example, where I live. Now, how much of the end product is going to be dictated by the Department of Commerce, and how much of it is going to be by the Federal Way Planning Department? And see, this is where I see the potential conflicts, and I'm not 100% certain. I hope you're right, but I'm not 100% certain that this is going to smooth out the process of people, Joe developer coming to my town and wanting to create, a townhome development, 5 or 6 or 10 units or whatever.
Mhm. Although I think the thing to keep in mind is ultimately all of these provisions of the statute of the state law have to be incorporated into the local development regulations. So looking at it from the perspective of the applicant, ultimately what the applicant will have to comply with is the city of Federal Way's development regulations, right? There won't be 2 sets of regulations that apply, one under this bill and one under Federal Way's. It's Federal Way's job to update their development regulations that at least meet these minimum standards. And that will be the development regulations that will apply to any project within Federal Way.
Okay.
Any questions on this? And if not, we can move on. I'll go to a few other bills maybe.
So I think that question I think for a lot of the new construction brokers is what about the other requirements as far as FAR, as far as setbacks, as far as impervious surface area? Do you know any as far as stormwater drainage, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Do we have any of the semantics as far as that's concerned?
Not really, in that this bill for middle housing types, the bill for accessory dwelling units doesn't make changes to any of those kind of specific, whether it's stormwater or setbacks or things like that. It just provides that the city can't have development regulations on those kinds of issues that are more stringent than what apply to single family zoning. So the setback issues and things like that are still things we're going to have to deal with, I think, at the local level, because we didn't get to the level of detail of saying, the setback can't be greater than 5 feet or things like that. I mean? It's interesting in the, in the context of dealing with state legislation, it does start to feel like you're at a city council meeting, because you're getting down to this level of detail on development regulations in state law. And our goal would have been to get even to that level of detail, but a lot of those things are not going to be, you're not going to resolve that in a piece of state legislation for all of the different cities. So those will still be constraints that you got to figure out locally. The other thing too that I'd say is, this is it's not identical, but it has some similarities to a law that Oregon passed, similar to what a law in California passed. Minnesota, like the Minneapolis kind of greater metropolitan area, passed something like this. And I don't expect that you'll see this huge upswell in like duplexes to fourplexes, right? Because I think the economy of scale is probably not there for a lot of these kind of projects. It'll be a project here and there, is my expectation, but I don't know. It's hard to, it's hard to explain. I'm an attorney and a lobbyist in Olympia. I'm not the developer you guys are. So I don't know what people's expectations are, but at least in the law passed in California, they've not seen this huge kind of upswell in like 4plex to 6plex. Where there has been an increase is in accessory dwelling unit construction. I think because of the cost and the more kind of simplicity of that construction type.
So we have a question in the chat, Bill. What about height restrictions already in place? So 35 feet for most of the area, but this bill doesn't affect height restrictions, correct?
No, it does not. It does not. Yeah, it does not. So yeah, I mean, that's like one of the issues, right? Let's say you're in an area that, let's say you have a small little, you know, and I know Seattle has like a little micro lot kind of zoning classification. And frankly, most areas of Seattle, they're beyond much of this anyway, right? I think the bigger change will be in some of the suburban cities, but if you're in a super small lot that could allow a sixplex, but you can't go that high anyway, you may not get to a sixplex anyway because of height restrictions and the size of the lot and things like that. So, but yeah, the height restrictions that are in place are not affected by the bill.
And then, so can you, I'm getting some questions via text message, but
Yeah.
So the bill passes in 3 months, it's enacted. How quickly do cities have to adopt this new legislation?
They will have to have this implemented 6 months from their next comprehensive plan update. So King County, Pierce County, Snohomish, and Kitsap have to update all of their GMA comp plans and development regulations by the end of 2024. So it'll be 6 months from the end of 2024.
And what about the smaller cities that say we're not gonna do that? We're not gonna update our plan for 10 years.
And so in those, so all cities within those 4 counties have to do it by that deadline. And then if you're in, you know, Spokane County's deadline is 1 more year out. Clarke County is 1 more year out. You know, like a town like Yakima is more than 75,000. So they're pulled into the bill because they're over 75,000. Their comp plan update is 2025. So it'll be 6 months from the end of 2025. So that's kind of their deadline. And then if a city, let's play it out and say a city adopts their development regulations and comp plan and stuff, and they don't comply with these requirements, it's like any other comp plan that can be appealed based on non-compliance with the GMA. These are now requirements of the Growth Management Act that cities have to comply with based on their size and location.
I could see the big, you know, sort of pushbacks would be like Edmonds and Mercer Island,
Yeah.
and Sammamish, where they tend to be relatively restrictive as far as all of this is concerned, and now they're being forced to sort of update this. And so for those particular cities, we're looking at basically mid 2024.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and so what you'll see is between now and the end of the year, Department of Commerce, which does Growth Management Act implementation work with local governments, they got a substantial amount of funding to develop guidance on what cities have to do to comply with all these requirements. Secondly, some of the money from the legislature passes through Commerce to pay for the cost of the cities to do their comp plan updates over the next year and a half or so. And so the guidance will come out from Department of Commerce by the end of this year. And then during 2024, cities will, use that guidance to actually do the proposed updates to their comp plan. And that's like any other city council process where they update development regulations with, public hearings and all of those kinds of things. So that'll play out during 2024. I see the question on accessory dwelling units. There's a separate bill, so we can talk about that. Another bill that passed was House Bill 1337, and that's a bill that applies to all cities within Washington that plan under the Growth Management Act. So regardless of population size or location, if you're within a GMA planning county, which is, along the I-5 corridor, all those counties, and about half of the Eastern Washington counties, in all those cities have to allow accessory dwelling units. They have to allow at least 2 accessory dwelling units per lot. And 1337, actually, John.
1337? Okay.
Yeah, and this is another bill that we're working on, kind of a 1-page summary of to get out to folks. And one of the provisions is that you can have accessory dwelling units condoed, meaning if you had an existing, let's say you have a single lot, you could build an accessory dwelling unit, then then split the lot or condominiumize those two and sell them separately. What it says is that cities cannot prohibit that from being done. So if you had an existing accessory dwelling unit now, you could condominiumize that. If you built one now and then wanted to either do a lot split or condominiumize later, you could also do that. And this is a bill that I think will have, I mean, again, it's like the challenge when you pass something at the state level is it depends on, does it fit the lot? Does it fit the market of what people actually want to build? The accessory dwelling unit bill was patterned to some extent after the accessory dwelling unit ordinance that City of Seattle passed. And you have seen a pretty significant increase in accessory dwelling units within the City of Seattle. There's some other provisions in this, you know, you have to allow 2 per lot. Setbacks can still apply except for rear lot setbacks. You can have directly like a 0 lot line accessory dwelling unit on the alleyway, for example, on a back lot line. And with there's also a provision that cities cannot require, they can, I think there's 1,000 square foot minimum that cities have to allow. So some cities have said, well, you can have an ADU, but it can only be 400 square feet, 800 square feet. They have to allow at least 1,000 square feet. Again, the property owner has the option to build one smaller if they want. So a lot of this legislation is similar to the middle housing bill, and that the kind of framework of it is you have to allow these things to be built, but you can't do X, Y, and Z. You can't require off-street parking for ADUs. You can't require frontage improvements to build an ADU. So it's trying to kind of, you know, reduce the numbers of types of regulations that cities can adopt to prevent construction of ADUs. That's the kind of concept.
So as far as that's concerned, I mean, are you allowed to, is short platting just not, I mean, how do they short plat versus condominiumize, right? Because most of the time you see a dadu and you're seeing them condominiumize that particular lot, and you have the front lot and you have the back lot, and that's a dadu with the original house. Do you see us being able to short plat that so they're individual tax numbers, or is that just not addressed here?
Yeah, so the one bill that didn't pass, and this is where we still have some work to do next year, there was a bill just on the issue of lot splitting itself, and it made it out of the House, didn't make it through the Senate committee. And what it would have required is for all cities to allow lot splitting of lots down to the size of 2,000 square feet. I think Seattle's small lot ordinance, they have forget what the exact zoning or classification is called, but I think they allow it down to 1,500 square feet. California passed a statewide law that cities have to allow lots as small as 1,200 square feet. Our bill had 2,000 square feet, and it was a provision that that the lot splitting is not done through the short plat process, but it would be done through an administrative process that was really based on boundary line adjustments. So the idea is a very streamlined administrative process for lot splitting. Still requires city approval to create that new lot, because with boundary line adjustments, you can't create a new buildable lot. It's kind of the general law for boundary line adjustments, but through that process you could. That one we still have to get sorted out next year, with the idea that you could split off a lot as small as 2,000 square feet, then build a separate, you have separate tax parcel number on that, build it, sell it separately. But then the other piece to add is another bill that passed dealt with condominium issue, with a number of different condominium issues. That bill provides that all cities have to allow unit lot subdivisions, and unit lot subdivisions are like, I think Seattle has it. I know Snohomish County has it, where you create small fee simple townhouse lots. And I think that'll be a more common technique that I think if there's an uptick of that activity with some of our members around in the cities that have it. So
makes sense. And then Paul asked us,
yeah, there is a provision that they cannot mandate frontage improvements just for an ADU. So the answer to that is yes.
And street, so just for everybody else's clarity, street frontage improvements would be sidewalks and adding light posts and things along those lines.
Yeah.
And what about, do you see, as far as the drainage is concerned, so you're adding a whole bunch of, sort of impervious pavement issues. Do you anticipate that cities will try to make you put big old vaults for water in order to build these ADUs and to build more housing?
I don't know, that's hard to say, right? Because again, we know that even with just changing what can be built doesn't change some of those constraints. So I think it's going to depend on really how each individual city deals with that. Yeah.
I can imagine some cities will just make it so cost, sort of prohibitive that nothing will change in the character of the neighborhood, so to speak.
Yeah. No, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see that, because there was even though like a number of cities got to kind of, neutral-ish on this bill, Sammamish, Woodinville, Mercer Island, Bainbridge Island, certain areas around like, Innisard in that area up by like Shoreline, Edmonds, there was a fair amount of opposition to it, led by homeowners and some city council members in those areas. And so I would imagine now that the bill's passed, when it's implemented by those cities, I would expect to see, opposition from that level of kind of activist to make sure that, to make sure that whether it's infrastructure or water quality or stormwater, that those authorities that cities do have are like exercised to the maximum extent possible. That would not surprise me, which is again why, as these get implemented, our local realtor associations and others, home builders, et cetera, will have to be active in that, because like somebody noted, there are probably ways that cities could implement this in a way that make it far less meaningful than it could be. And on that question, there's nothing specific in the bill about undergrounding of anything. There are just provisions about, adequacy of sewer and water. It was interesting, especially like Bainbridge Island was interesting. A few other areas that don't have a lot of wastewater treatment wanted to make sure that the bill required potable water, meaning piped water from larger group A systems, meaning you can't have just private wells, what I call exempt wells, the small domestic wells, which are less common within cities, but they're more common in, kind of rural-ish areas like Bainbridge. But there's a pretty clear directive in the bill that there has to be potable water and sewer available.
Makes sense. So as far as opportunities concerned for realtors, are we looking, are there certain cities that you would say, hey, these are the cities that, have the capacity for sewer, water, so on and so forth? Is there anything that, sort of broad stroke, here's the opportunity zone for us?
Yeah, and we have not gotten to that level of detail yet, right? But I think that's the next place we should go, just so people know where those opportunities are, right? And it'll be driven by, obviously the real estate market, but what's in those areas now, and there's, and that's one of the challenges with this bill is there's such a variety of, it applies to Auburn, it applies to Issaquah. Those are vastly different markets. How's it going to play out? What's their infrastructure capacity like right now, right? That stuff we'll all have to figure out.
I could see a builder or a developer or even a real estate broker going and acquiring properties that know that things are going to change for them over the next couple of years and taking advantage of that today.
Yeah, that's kind of my read of from talking with a few of our members or master builder types that we've worked with on some of the legislative efforts, is they kind of see that right now we're in this period of guidance coming out from Department of Commerce before the end of the year, cities updating their development regulations during 2024, them being effective in early 2025. So we're in that period of 18 months or so of looking at what those opportunities might be. And it's going to be a really localized analysis.
I've had some pushback from some office leaders and some brokers that this, is this really truly hitting the middle housing? And one of the things that I've pushed back on is instead of a house, 1940s house sitting on a 7,000 square foot lot being torn down and that McMansion being built, you'll start to see a little bit more of that diversification of maybe 2 or 3 residences being built on there. And even though it's not quote unquote affordable, being $700,000, $800,000, $900,000, it's still much more affordable than the $4 million McMansion that they would have put on there had it not had this bill go through. Any other sort of when you're talking about this and you're lobbying for this, was that sort of the conversation piece, or was it
Yeah,
just more
there was a fair amount of that, and just the discussion of, within certain types of cities, is the kind of buy and tear down even a viable kind of product right now, right? And so it's like if you're in a, you guys are the real estate people, not me. I'm just a legal guy, and you're political hack in Olympia. But it's like if you're in a mid-market area, it's different than if you're in like Kirkland or areas like that. So it just depends on the market, right? And I think the interesting discussion with certain legislators is they see, you have a house in Kirkland, you tear it down, you replace it with 3 townhouses, and the townhouses are each $1.6 million. They're like, well, this isn't providing affordable housing. To which our response has always been, well, but it's providing 3 units instead of 1. And so 3 families are in those 3 units, and it opens up 3 other units, and that's just kind of the housing ladder. And I think people kind of accept that theory. It's hard to tell exactly how it's going to play out, though. And that's the other thing I think we've been pretty clear with legislators and with realtors members is, this bill, all the other bills that pass in and of itself, the legislature is finally doing what it should have done 15 years ago, right? I mean, my observation of the legislature on certain issues is they ultimately get around to doing the right thing about 10 years too late, and so like this type of infill development should have been allowed 10 years ago. And we're finally getting to that point right now. Are we going to catch up with the massive shortage? The data is the state needs 1 million housing units by 2045. It's a staggering amount of homes. This bill's not going to build, this legislation's not going to get 1 million units built, not even close, right? So. Let me do this too, John. Let me go to another document here and I'll spin through a few other bills that passed just for.
Eric, did you guys have a question?
Yeah, we did want to know if Bill was going to share this middle housing summary document, the Word doc.
Yeah. Did I send that to you yet, John? I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Let me find this other. All right, so this is from a group called Sightline, which I characterize as kind of an urbanist, housing group that we work with a lot. And they have some really interesting kind of housing economists that work for them, and they work in Seattle and Portland and other parts of the Northwest. This is kind of the full list of a number of different housing bills that passed, and a couple of, a number of these will have more kind of comprehensive summaries out here within the next month or so. So 1110 is when we talked about middle housing. 1337 we talked about, which is the ADU bill. Some of these I think are little kind of micro housing bills, right? They're not dramatically helpful. 1042 allows more housing units within existing multifamily buildings. There are some cities that were not allowing multifamily owners of multifamily rentals to basically create more units within that building. without having to pay additional impact fees or parking requirements. They'd say, if you have the examples that the multifamily housing association had were larger houses that were divided into a triplex, you could further make into a sixplex, or a 10 unit apartment you could convert to 20 units. Cities were opposing that on grounds of parking and impact fees and stuff. This removes a lot of the authority for cities to do that. So if people can make more housing units within an existing building, they're allowed to do so. 5491 is kind of a wonky bill. It was motivated by a bunch of legislators that did this housing tour in Scandinavia, where they have single stair apartment buildings. And their kind of takeaway from that was the building code, largely driven by fire safety requirements, where you have multiple staircases required under the building code, you end up eating up a lot of usable floor space. So it directs the state building code to allow single stair apartment buildings up to 6 stories, but then there's a kind of state building code council requirement to deal with some of the changes in ingress and egress that were the safety concerns. Again, it's a super, again, you're seeing the legislature getting into like details of the state building code, which is really not, the legislature typically tells the building code council, go do what you do. They don't mandate to the state building code to tell them what to do, and they did within this bill. 5258 is a bill we worked on originally, and it has about 4 or 5 different things in it. Originally, and you've probably heard this, one of the big issues in Washington state is our condominium defect warranty laws. We have a very strict liability standard for condominium developers compared to other states, and it's frequently cited too as one of the reasons why we see very little condominium development. The warranty was changed 3 years ago, probably not long enough ago to see if there's a market response yet. What 5258 originally did made 2 changes. One was it exempted small condominium projects, meaning 12 units or under, from that statutory warranty. So a construction defect in a new small condo project would be dealt with like a construction defect for a single family house. There's no statutory warranty for single family home construction. So if there was one for a small condo project, a lot of opposition to that from trial lawyers, from a lot of legislators that frankly believe strongly in the need for that condominium warranty to be in statute. So that part got taken out. The thing we were able to keep was this issue called right to cure, and right to cure is this idea within the condominium defect law that the developer should be given the opportunity to fix the defect rather than have it litigated. And so the right to cure process was changed so that the construction defect that is claimed by the unit owner or by the HOA has to be explained with some level of particularity by a person who has qualifications in that area. And the timing of the defect claim is changed to give the developer the opportunity to fix the defect rather than just have it litigated. I've talked to a couple folks that do insurance products for condominium developers. They think that part of the bill will be helpful. Make some changes in condominium financing so that people can put a larger deposit down, which some condominium builders say will help them get projects financed easier. And then it has that unit lot subdivision requirement. Parts of the bill apply to both condominium construction, but also to townhouse construction. So there has to be a process locally to allow unit lot subdivisions for small townhouse projects. 5058 was another condo bill. Again, gets into a really kind of wonky area of the state building code council, where if something is defined as a multi-unit residential building, then it has to go through a building closure design inspection, both when it's built and on any subsequent resale. And the point that we're trying to make in both 5258 and in 5058 is these smaller condo projects, whether they're 4 units or 10 units, frankly, they're not much bigger than a really big house. They might be a 10,000 square foot building. They have the same foundation, framing, siding, windows, etc. But yet they get stuck with the regulatory requirements of a 30-story tower condo in downtown Seattle, right? So trying to make the building code provisions for small condo projects more like single family construction. This exempts small condos from that multi-unit residential building definition which gets them out of the enclosure design inspection requirements for construction and then for subsequent resale. 1181 is a bill that's been around. It adds climate change planning requirements to the Growth Management Act. When it initially was introduced, and this was 3 years ago, it was a pretty unwieldy kind of sweeping bill on, carbon reduction and reduction in vehicle miles traveled. But we worked on a lot of changes to kind of to get to neutral on it. It frankly reflects, I think, what a lot of cities, at least central Puget Sound cities, are doing already on a lot of climate change planning. It does have some helpful kind of housing related parts in it, driving cities to have more housing near transit to reduce reliance on vehicles and things like that. 1293 is the bill I mentioned, streamlining design review, so that design review requirements have to be more clear and objective and not kind of subjective standards. There's not a lot of design review that applies to residential construction. It's a bigger issue, I think, for multifamily construction within certain cities that have real kind of strict design review processes. And jump in if you have questions, but I'll just keep burning through these. 5412 is the bill that provides an exemption from the State Environmental Policy Act for residential development, both single and multifamily residential development within urban growth areas. And the point here is the State Environmental Policy Act, known as SEPA, was adopted in the early 70s. And at that time, it was kind of the first kind of major environmental law that applied to things like residential construction. But since then, there are increasingly stringent septic requirements, stormwater requirements, tree ordinances, things like that, that more specifically regulate environmental impacts of development, so that SEPA doesn't really do anything other than create opportunities for appeal. And so a lot of appeals now against residential or commercial projects are SEPA appeals on kind of aesthetic impacts, things like, glare or height or noise or things like that, that should be dealt with by a more specific development regulation. So by exempting these types of projects from SEPA, this was kind of the primary bill for the home builder community, because SEPA for them has been a real problem the last, decade or so. 5290 is the bill that I'd mentioned on streamlining some of the permitting processes. And it's trying to move cities all toward a single kind of portal type requirement, so that the applicant can do all online permitting. Some of the cities that you probably run into have some pretty antiquated permitting systems. It also kind of makes more stringent. There's a 120-day permit requirement that cities are supposed to meet for review and issuance of building permit decisions. It makes that more specific so that cities will meet that 120-day timeline. 1074 and 5179 are kind of damage deposit eviction kind of landlord tenant bills, not huge bills from the realtor's perspective. 1474 is one you may have heard of. It adds $100 to the document recording fee. That $100 goes to create a down payment assistance and closing cost program for first-time home buyers who were discriminated against through racial covenants. And this was a really interesting bill. In a number of sessions, and this goes back 15 years, document recording fee increases have been used to fund homelessness programs and other kind of low-income housing programs. Some of those realtors have opposed, some of them we've been neutral on. This one we supported, and I worked a lot with Phil McBride on the racial covenant bill that we did 3 years ago. And I know John L. Scott's been super active in, working with Amazon and others to help identify neighborhoods where there are racial covenants so that homeowners can have those removed if they want. This is kind of the next step in that line of activity, which is actually creating a funding program for people of color to become homeowners. And there was a racial disparities home ownership work group that the legislature created 2 years ago. And their number one recommendation was the biggest obstacle for people of color to become homeowners is down payment assistance. So this program creates a down payment assistance program solely for people of color that will be implemented by the state through the Housing Finance Commission. So it's a pretty interesting bill that'll get signed next week. 1771 was a relocation assistance bill for mobile homes. These other ones were not super major bills. So yeah, why don't I leave it at that? We don't need to go through all of those. So those are like the ones that we'll get more details out on will be 5290 on permitting, 1474 on the covenant, the $100 homeownership program, 5412, 1293, the 2 condo bills, the ADU bill, and middle housing. Those are the ones that to us are kind of the primary housing supply bills.
So Bill, have you spoken to any of the condo developers, and have you heard anybody saying now that this is, you know, the right to cure aspect, they're gonna start building that, or they're gonna convert apartments?
Yeah, it's a good question. As the bill started, it had about 6 or 7 different kind of condo townhouse issues in it, and we sent it out pretty broadly to condo developers, their attorneys, people who insure condo projects that do a lot of the major condo projects in the last decade or so. And I was surprised at the lack of interest in additional changes to like the condo warranty issue. We couldn't really stimulate a lot of stimulate interest from the developer community, and I'm not sure why that is, because I don't know if it's that whether they build multifamily rentals or condos, they're still building, and they're just building a different product, and that's really what they want to be doing. But I still think we have work to do in the condo space, because from what I've heard from at least a few of the attorneys that represent condo developers and a couple insurance companies, the right to cure part will be helpful, but there's still, I think, some challenges in the condo market.
Agreed.
And on that note, if you guys run into folks that are in that space, we keep kind of sending out blast emails and trying to figure out what else we should be doing on the state legislative level. The one couple bills that I'll note that didn't pass, I talked about that lot splitting bill that was close to passing, and just a lot of little details about how lot splitting would be integrated with the middle housing bill, because cities raised this. It was a clever lobbying term they used called lot-mageddon, where not only would you have middle housing where now you have duplexes and fourplexes and sixplexes, then you'd have lots being split off of existing lots. So where you'd have one lot, it's not just moving from one house to 4 units, you'd have a split lot, so you'd move from one house to 8 units, right? And trying to understand how the two would kind of work together or not. So that lot splitting will be back. The other bill of a lot of interest was a bill on transit-oriented development, and that gets back to your, I think, condo question, John. The transit-oriented development bill was a bill that had significant upzones in basically the half-mile area from all transit, meaning bus rapid transit, bus lines, light rail, and commuter rail at a fairly high level, right? That was the metric for that bill, was in floor area ratio. And it was in areas like close to Sound Transit light rail, floor area ratio would be a minimum of like 4, right? And so, if you look at a lot of like 5/2 kind of construction, typically that's going to be a floor area ratio of like 3.5, typically, stuff like that. And so it really was forcing the cities who have the Sound Transit light rail and bus rapid transit within their cities to allow significant upzones within those areas. It passed the Senate. It didn't pass the House, and what the House got to was, and it's an interesting philosophical question, and to see what you guys think, is the way that certain people in the certain legislators in certain cities look at it, is that housing density is a commodity, right? It's a form of value, and that the state owns it or cities own it. They're not going to give the developer or the development community an upzone for free, because that then increases the value of the developer's property, because they can now build more units. They're not going to just allow you as the developer to build more units without extracting something in return in the form of affordable housing mandates. And so it passed the House without any affordable housing mandate. What we worked on when the bill was in the House was to say, cities have authority right now to enact affordable housing programs locally, right? So Seattle has the MHA program. where certain projects have to have, 4 to 11% of the units are affordable, or you can pay a fee in lieu of those affordable units. And that money goes to create subsidized housing within the city. That was developed locally to reflect what the Seattle market can withstand. Redmond has a program like that. Kirkland has a program like that. What the House was proposing is a 20% affordability requirement, which a lot of the multifamily developers said in Federal Way they can't get market rate transit-oriented development right now with no affordability mandate. If you impose that kind of mandate in some of those areas, it just won't pencil out. But that'll be an interesting issue the rest of this year and next year in the legislature on this idea that either the state or the cities should not just give away density for free without exacting some affordability requirement in exchange for that. That's kind of what High Center, that TOD bill, but it's the TOD bill where you have larger projects. They get back to the condo issue, which is a lot of people are asking, well, if all these larger transit-oriented development projects around Central Puget Sound are just rentals, we're going to continue to see this bottoming out of the home ownership rate. And so the condo issue, I think, goes hand in hand with the transit-oriented development issue, where you'll have more multifamily construction and trying to figure out what does it take to make sure that some of those TOD projects are condominium projects, not just rentals. Other questions?
Yeah,
Lot
questions for the group.
lot of info. And yeah, like I said, take it all in, and then, John or Bobby or whoever, check back with me or Nathan about, what information would be helpful as we kind of develop implementation efforts and stuff on any of these bills. I know Bobby's not shy about calling Nathan and telling him what to do.
Bobby's not shy about calling anybody.
No, I know.
Yes, Eric.
So my question is on bills 1110 and 1337 is addressing the fourplex and the ADUs. Is there any intention to addressing affordability through mobile homes? Since a lot of the parks make the rental space as much as another mortgage?
I don't know about that. I can't say that question came up in terms of how that would be dealt with, right? Because if each lot, I don't know, if you have a mobile home park, do you have individual lots that are individual tax parcel lots that each could have a duplex or fourplex? I'm not sure how that would relate to existing mobile home parks right now. I just can't say.
Thank you.
Other questions out there? Well, Bill,
One more.
one more.
In reading the rules, I just wasn't sure if when you're adding new housing, if it has to be a minimum of a duplex that you're adding, or if you can just add one more, single family house onto a lot.
You could do that too, right? Because you could call it cottage housing. So again, it's the idea is, and that's why I think, like what's on the screen now where it says 1110 legalizes middle housing options like duplexes. Really what the law says is 2 units per lot. And then cities have to allow 6 of the 9 middle housing types, but they have to allow at least 2 units, right? So it could be 2 single family homes on the same lot. One's an ADU, one's the primary dwelling unit. It could be a duplex, it could be townhouses, right? So there's some options there for how, and that's again why I think the implementation by the cities in terms of what form of 2 units of housing do they allow? That's where that'll be decided.
That's my question. Is building a duplex, the regulations around building a duplex and the regulations around building an ADU just redundant?
They are, I think they get at the same point, which is in the areas where you have to at least allow 2 units per lot, you could have a primary dwelling unit and an ADU, and that satisfies 2 units.
So, because, I mean, for years, because of zoning, we were not allowed to call us, a single-family dwelling with an ADU, a duplex, because, it didn't allow the owner to actually rent it out. We used to always call it a mother-in-law apartment, so it wouldn't, offend the regulations. But now, seeing how the state wants this to be, to increase density, why can't we just get rid of all the ADU regulations and call it a duplex? Because that's what, in end effect, this is what it is. So it's like, it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, but we're gonna call it a pigeon because nobody wants ducks.
Yeah. Yeah, and also one of the provisions in the accessory dwelling unit bill is that cities cannot impose an owner occupancy requirement. That's another thing that a lot of cities have done, is to say you can build an accessory dwelling unit, but there has to be an owner occupancy requirement for the primary dwelling unit, right? So the homeowner has to live in the house. They can rent out the ADU separately, but if they sell the house or if they move, then they can't rent out the ADU. Cities are now prohibited from doing that.
Okay, so in end effect, it's a duplex.
Say that one more time.
So in end effect, it's a duplex.
Yeah, it is. Legally, it functions that way. Yeah, once you get rid of the owner occupancy requirement, there's 2 housing units that could be rented separately. The owner doesn't have to live on site, etc. Yeah.
So my question is that if you upzone, but you still have FAR, this really cancel it out, right? So like in Bellevue, if you have a RS 7200, you can do a ADU, but if you are RS 10, then the FAR went away. So why don't we push for that to have no FAR? If you're gonna do the high density, FAR is really gonna kill this.
And that gets to a level of detail on the Bellevue regulations I just don't know. I couldn't say.
Other questions? Well, I think this has been really helpful, Bill. I really appreciate you kind of going through all of this, and
Yeah.
I think there's still lots to learn, and we're looking forward to sort of the dissection of what this does, and then ultimately it's going to be interesting to see what each city does with regard to their enacting this with their local plan. So we'll be actively waiting to hear what that looks like over the next couple of years. But I appreciate you taking the time today to spend with us and going through this. Whatever you forward me, I'll make sure I forward out to everybody that's on the call.
Okay.
So if you are on the call and you don't receive anything from me, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at johnhunter@johnlscott.com. And in the meantime, have a wonderful day, and hopefully it gets a little bit more sunny and a little bit more warm. So appreciate you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you.
Thank you.